Is sacrifice an important feature in many religious traditions?
Sacrifice can take a number of forms, from the actual slaughtering of a living being to a more symbolic offering up of something dear to the sacrificer. The Latin root, sacrum, holy, and facere, to make, suggests that the object sacrificed and the one, performing the action become holy or sacred. Some traditions, such as Islam and Hinduism, continue ancient rites of bloody sacrifice by killing animals, either to commemorate some similar act attributed to an important holy person of the past or because a certain deity requires it. In other traditions, ancient sacrificial rituals have been either abrogated altogether, since the destruction of Judaism's temple, or symbolically transformed into an unbloody substitute, as in Christian reenactments of the Lord's Supper.
Have Jews used symbolism to remind them of the temple since its destruction in 70 CE?
Many illuminated manuscripts of the Bible and other important Hebrew texts have included a 1 or 2 page spread depicting the various implements or ritual objects once used in the temple. These pages show all of the more portable items mentioned in the text of Exodus 25 to 30. They include, among other things, the tablets of the law, the menorah, the table supporting the containers of the 12 loaves of sacred bread, a bronze laver used for ceremonial purification, the ram's horn, shofar, and the incense burner. Decorative panels or hangings, called mizrach or east since they are hung on a home's eastern wall toward Jerusalem, also frequently depict a building meant to be the Jerusalem temple. Sometimes these hangings show temple implements rather than the building itself. The mizrach is a reminder not only of the ancient temple, but of the holy city of Jerusalem, toward which Jews turn when they pray. Another ritual object that often uses imagery of the temple is the Hanukkah lamp. Though some lamps look very much like the standard 7-branch menorah, many take the form of a small architectural design that can be either hung on the wall or set on a table. The architectural imagery sometimes depicts the back interior wall of a synagogue, with its arch flanked by 2 pillars meant to recall the 2 pillars of the temple representing Boaz and Jachin. Sometimes the Hanukkah lamp bears an elaborate architectural facade. The metalsmith's version of what the temple looked like.
What's the difference between a prophet and a messenger?
Central to Islamic tradition is the belief that God communicates ultimate truths through specially chosen persons called prophets. Without prophetic revelation, human beings would be forced to rely on intellect alone, and thus could not arrive at the knowledge necessary to attain their final purpose. Every prophet, Nabi, pronounced Nabi, passes along the divine word to a particular people and inevitably meets with tremendous resistance, at least initially. Some of these prophets receive the further designation of messenger or apostle. Rasul, pronounced Rasul, one who is sent. God sends but one messenger to a given people. Prophets specified as messengers include Noah, Lot, Ishmael, Moses, Shu'ab, Hud, Saleh, Jesus, and of course Muhammad. Prophets preach and warn their people. But messengers are also commissioned to lead a community of faith called an ummah. Post-Quranic tradition also teaches that messengers function as lawgivers, whereas the other prophets do not. In short, one might say that all messengers are prophets, but not all prophets are messengers.
Apart from the trigrams and taiji, what are some common traditional symbols?
Ancient lore associates fundamental features of Chinese cosmology with specific symbols. It all goes back to the Chinese atom, Pangu. In his task of imposing order on primal chaos, Pangu enlisted the help of 5 cosmic assistants: Azure Dragon, White Tiger, Phoenix, Tortoise, and Unicorn. Pangu assigned to each of the first 4 a quarter of the universe. Azure Dragon governed the East, associated with spring, new life, benevolence, and protection. White Tiger ruled the autumnal West, symbol of maturity and a life well spent. All made possible by good government and courage. Phoenix, the ultimate solar bird, presided over the summery south with the kindly warmth and joy that arises in a world at peace. Hard-shelled and indomitable, the ageless tortoise faced the unforgiving, wintry north. Wandering freely among them all, the rare and delicate unicorn was commissioned to appear wherever and whenever benevolence and justice reigned on earth. It is not surprising that all 5 of these wondrous beings retain their appeal to the popular imagination and remain essentials of the religious symbolic repertoire. A cluster of items associated loosely with Daoism are called the 8 Daoist emblems. Each represents one of the 8 immortals, a group of human beings who became immortal in various ways. They appear often as decorative motifs on all kinds of objects. The emblems are a fan, a sword, a gourd, castanets, a flower basket, a bamboo drum, a flute, and a lotus flower. This is one of several sets of 8 motifs popular in Chinese art and, along with the 8 Buddhist emblems, one that still carries specifically religious resonances.
Are there distinctive forms of Hindu initiation?
Boys of the twice-born castes are initiated into the tradition in special ceremonies called Upanayana, which mark the beginning of formal instruction in sacred learning. The initiate receives a thread and wears it draped across the shoulder as a symbol of this second birth. Women no longer receive the thread and only Brahmins nowadays wear it when not engaged in ritual ceremonies. Sacred threads are of white wool for Brahmins, of red hemp for Kshatriyas, and of yellow wool for Vaishyas. Tradition dictated that Brahmins be initiated at 7 or 8 years of age, Kshatriyas at 11, and Vaishyas at 12. But regardless of caste, most of those who still engage in the formal ceremony generally associated with puberty.
What other early scriptures are especially important for Hindus?
Over a span of perhaps 2,000 years, c. 3000 to 1000 BCE, according to some Indian scholars, Hindu ritual specialists produced a substantial body of sacred literature by way of commentary and reflection on the Vedas. The earliest of these works were manuals for priests, or brahmanas, each attached to one of the 4 Vedas. These brahmanas elaborated on the mythic stories to which the Vedic hymns often had made only passing allusions. Expanding on the tradition much as the early Jewish rabbis had developed the oral Torah, the brahmanas served the practical purpose of recording for posterity precise directions for correct ritual performance. Still another layer of scriptural development gave rise to a series of works called Aranyakas, forest treatises, composed by and for hermits. These texts offered further commentary on the Vedas meant to foster the contemplative life. Aranyakas were connected with the Brahmanas much as the Brahmanas were linked to the various Vedas, with their emphasis on inward reflection. The Aranyakas signal an important turn away from the ancient Vedic and Brahmanical reliance on external ritual. Another type of sacred text called the Upanishads evolved from about 1500 to 500 BCE. The name Upanishad means, loosely, sitting at the feet of a mentor. These remarkable documents, many in the form of a dialogue between teacher and student, reflect deeply on the nature of the divine and of the self. Life's true meaning rests not primarily in dealing with forces beyond human control, but in understanding both the ultimate causes of all things and the relationship of the self to those causes. The Upanishads represent major developments known collectively as Vedanta, the end or culmination of the Vedas.
Do Shinto practitioners use special symbolism in personal or private rituals?
Many Japanese households have a special corner dedicated to the kami, a miniature shrine building. Kami dana, at which worshippers pray daily, is placed on a shelf or table. For special occasions they will go to the actual shrine. But everyday reverence to the kami happens at home. People can purchase these charming miniature shrines, some done up in exquisitely fine architectural detail, at religious goods stores in any Japanese city or at some of the larger shrines. Worshippers who get them from shrine shops often prefer to purchase them at shrines to which their families have ancestral connections. Priests often visit parishioners to dedicate their new home shrines, and sometimes make annual house visits for brief renewal ceremonies. People with more ample homes and yards might afford larger outdoor miniature shrines called yashikigami, kami of the home. Miniature shrines range from simple and affordable to finely wrought and costly. Business establishments, restaurants, police stations, and bridges on ocean-going ships, for example, might also have a kamidana to which the staff make daily offerings. Many miniature shrines have their own tiny torii gates and shimenawa. In addition, worshippers often bring small votive offerings when they visit local shrines. A popular offering is the miniature torii gate on which devotees write names and prayers of petition before hanging it on a rack along with hundreds of others like it at the shrine.
Who are some important female deities?
Amaterasu, the sun goddess, is the most important of the goddesses. Hundreds of shrines throughout Japan are dedicated to her. One of the most colorful goddesses is Ama no Uzume, the terrible female of heaven. Widely popular because of her identification with frivolity and dance. A kami described as both masculine and feminine is Inari, because of her association with rice harvest. Inari is among the most important deities. Her messenger is the fox, and popular custom often refers to the fox itself as Inari. Bright reddish orange or red torii gates, sometimes in great numbers, usually mark shrines dedicated to Inari. A pair of goddesses associated with the war kami Hachiman appear in a sculptural triad with Hachiman. One is called Nikitsuhime, but the other remains to be identified. Seiryu Gongjin was one of several goddesses adopted by Shinto in their role as protectors of Buddhist temples. Two other imported goddesses with Buddhist connections are Zenmyo Nyoshin and Byakuko Shin. Stories tell of how a Korean monk fell in love with Zenmyo while he was studying in China. Byakuko was once an Indian earth deity who became a Shinto kami through her associations with powers of nature. Goddesses like Kumino Fusumai Okamai are often depicted round and full to suggest abundance. Goddess Tamiyuri-hime appears in a triad, flanked by two other goddesses. Once worshipped as the three protectresses of children. Tamayori was the daughter of Wadatsumai no Kami, Kami of the oceans, and Japan's first emperor's mother. Benten, also called Benzaiten, is a goddess of Indian origin. Hindus know her as Sarasvati, consort of the god Brahma and patroness of culture. She plays the Japanese lute, called the biwa, as Sarasvati plays the veena. And devotees beseech her for protection and for gifts of eloquence and knowledge. Numerous female kami have played important roles in Shinto life over the centuries. And some were frequently depicted in human form, but only a few remain significant in contemporary devotion.
Do Shinto practitioners run private schools for their children?
Private schools equivalent to parochial educational systems in some other traditions have not been institutionally significant in the history of Shinto. Perhaps the closest thing to structured education in Shinto beliefs and values have been occasional government attempts to insert components of Shinto-i.e. traditional or national Japanese ethics into school curricula. In 1937, for example, the Ministry of Education incorporated themes from an 1890 imperial document on education into a new ethics curriculum called Principles of the National Entity, Kokyutai no Hongi, meant to implement the concept of state Shinto. The document emphasizes the historicity of the classic mythical narratives concerning the emperor's divine descent. It praises unquestioning dedication to the corporate good of the Japanese people under the virtuous rule of the emperor. These pre-war governmental actions, however, are entirely different from the grassroots impulses that gave rise to private religious schools in traditions such as Islam and Christianity. There is really no Shinto parallel. In fact, the Meiji and subsequent regimes attempt to teach ethics from on high. So to speak, explicitly forbade religious education on the local or shrine level. Since World War II, however, numerous shrines throughout Japan have developed programs for children and young people, including nursery schools and kindergartens. But these are exclusively social and cultural, rather than religiously educational, developments.
What is the historical and religious significance of Tiananmen Square?
In June of 1989, media coverage of the so-called Tiananmen Square massacre brought world prominence to one of China's most important public spaces. The huge plaza stands directly south of the Forbidden City and is named after the city's massive southern outer gate. The Gate of Heavenly Peace, Tiananmen, literally Heaven Peace Gate. In a matter of days the space had become a globally recognized symbol for a younger China's struggle for democracy. But Tiananmen Square had been a powerful symbol for the Chinese people for some years before 1989. Early revolutionary publications spoke of the place as the people's guiding star, the emblem of the new China. Situated just south of the ancient seat of empire, the square was created as a clear revolutionary response to imperial repression. The open People's Square was an obvious counterpoint to the exclusivity and mystery of the Forbidden City. Its placement to the south of the palace also meant that the square overpowered the palace by virtue of its greater access to yang energy, a symbolism surely not lost on countless traditional Chinese. Mao Zedong and his communist colleagues preferred to play off their new symbols of power against the old. They could have chosen simply to destroy the trappings of the decadent regime. But they might thereby have risked investing the former symbols with even greater power in the popular imagination. Better to reduce them to the status of mere museums. In the square now stand Communist Beijing's Great Hall of the People and the Museums of Chinese History and of the Chinese Revolution. Contemporary replacements for the old imperial symbolism. Between them and to the south stands the mausoleum of Chairman Mao, d. 1976, but facing north rather than south as the imperial centers had done for over 3,000 years. The goal of countless pilgrims today, Mao's Memorial Hall functions as a quasi-religious monument even in its rejection of China's imperial religious tradition.
What are Hasidic Jews?
Some of the biblical prophets emphasized the notion of God's unconditional, absolutely faithful love, chesed in Hebrew. They taught that God would continue to seek out sinners and bring them back. Out of that emphasis grew an important theme in Jewish spirituality. A focus on the transforming power of divine compassion. Learning and moral righteousness were still worthy goals, of course, but not to such a degree that they should raise divisions in a community that amounted to religious class distinctions. Most important was the quest for individual salvation sought within community. A major movement organized around these emphases was begun in Eastern Europe by Israel ben Eliezer, c. 1700 to 1760, known as the Baal Shem Tov, Master of the Good Name, that is that of God. He was a highly charismatic man with a reputation for working wonders, especially healing. He de-emphasized Talmudic scholarship in favor of devotional intensity. After his death, the Hasidic movement became more formally organized as a closed society. Around the person of a charismatic leader called the Tzaddik, literally, righteous one. As the community grew, subgroups developed and carried the spirit of the tradition abroad. Most notably to Israel and New York. The Chabad branch moved more toward scholarship and education while other groups stayed focused on emotional involvement in devotion. Hasidic groups have often been excommunicated even though none have formally broken away.
Who are the principal deities in CIT?
CIT's formal recognition of members of its pantheon went through many changes over the course of more than 3,000 years. Here are some of the principal features of this vast and rather fluid phenomenon. Deities and heavenly powers generally fit into a three-level system. At the top were the powers deemed most necessary to cosmic survival. Ancient tradition includes belief in a mysterious celestial power called Shang. Eventually the word Di came to be the standard term now translated as emperor. But Shang Di was still the supreme emperor. Standard Chinese religious usage also referred to Tian, heaven, as a generic term for the region in which Shangdi lived. Neither Shangdi nor Tian was a personal deity actively involved in human affairs. They were rather the generic source of all things manifest in the universe. But there was yet another power behind Shangdi and Tian. That was the Dao, whose eternal energies of Yang and Yin are manifest in the universe and made known to humanity as the will of heaven. Also on the top level were the royal ancestors, the spirits of earth and grain. And the earth, sometimes referred to as Empress to Heaven's Emperor. A notch lower came the principal heavenly bodies, Sun and Moon, and Jupiter, whose revolutions of the Sun determine the ritual calendar. Rulers of earlier dynasties, patrons of farming and silk cultivation. And the spirits of heaven and earth round out the second level. Confucius was once a member of the second rank, but was elevated to the first in 1907. At the third level, CIT begins to overlap somewhat with Daoism and CCT, with their more specialized and local deities. Here are gathered the deities of fire, literature, war, artillery, soil, mechanical arts, the hearth, the granary, and the home threshold. Along with the patron deity of Beijing are three dragon deities associated with the city. Finally, several historical heroes fit here as well. A deity called Guandi or Guangong deserves special mention as a crossover figure important in more than one pantheon listing. Guandi is known by a wide variety of names, depending on the constituency of worshippers. Many people identify him as the god of war, though the red-faced, full-bearded deity is chiefly a paragon of civic virtue. The emperor had the authority to rearrange, shrink, or expand the pantheon. He could simply decree a spirit worthy of a particular rank and eventually even declare worship of that being the practice of the realm by instituting temples in his or her honor.
What are some of the main varieties of Daoist officials or specialists?
Since about the 4th century CE, religious specialists called Dao Shi, masters of the Dao, have led Daoist communities at prayer. These leaders can be celibate monks. There are also nuns called Daogu, who live almost exclusively in monastic communities. Monastic priests, mostly members of the Complete Realization Order, occasionally perform public rituals. But, not unlike cloistered monks in some other traditions, their principal focus is on their more private spiritual pursuits. Some ritual specialists are married family men who live near a monastery. These so-called lay masters, Qigong, make up the majority of Daoist ritual specialists. Individuals generally specialize in certain types of ritual, such as exorcism and faith healing. Among the non-monastic, those ritualists whose functions most closely resemble those of priests in various other traditions are called the Black Hats. Many of them belong to the Celestial Masters School, perhaps the oldest of all Daoist organizations. In addition to the black hats, the official and intricately trained priests, there are the red turbans known as Fashi, specialists in the occult. Black hats, so called because of their small mandarin cap with a gold knob on top, are authorized to perform both the greater festivals and the more ordinary ceremonies to which the red turbans are restricted. The two groups are alternatively known as blackheads and redheads. Specialists of earlier times called libationers in the Celestial Masters School had the triple duty of religious instruction, local administration, and ritual leadership. Not unlike the typical parish pastor in many Christian denominations.
Are there Confucian or CIT hierarchical structures?
Confucian thought discerns an essential need for hierarchies in all aspects of human society. It is a question of order. Human beings may be identical in essence, but they clearly differ in personal attributes. Talents, knowledge, and age, to name only a few distinguishing characteristics. Confucius believed that realism required taking account of those differences. Take the challenge of living an ethical life, for example. Each stage in life has its unique problems. Young people need to conquer sensuality, adults combativeness, and the elderly greed. As for the variety of human capabilities, Confucius saw 4 levels. Those who possess knowledge from birth, those capable of becoming superior persons by acquiring knowledge. Those who learn only with great effort, and those not at all disposed to learning. Confucian thinking has often been very class-conscious. The master believed that society needed stratification in order to function smoothly. At the top was the scholar, supported by the farmer who produce life's basic needs. Artisans who make practical items, merchants who buy and sell what others produce. And soldiers who, unfortunately, often wreck what others make. Within the highest echelons of the Confucian hierarchy there were still further distinctions. Until around 1530, those enshrined in Confucian memorial halls were ranked according to titles taken from imperial administration. Confucian greats were honored as king, duke, marquis, or earl, for example. After 1530, Confucians replaced those royal honorifics with the titles sage, correlate, especially learned one, worthy one, and scholar. Over the course of history, some individuals within the Confucian hierarchy have been promoted, others demoted in rank, and still others restored after being demoted. Such hierarchical adjustments have depended a great deal on ideological leanings within various imperial regimes. The last major rearrangement occurring around 1724 CIT was, of course, hierarchical, but with the emperor at the top and a much higher place allotted to the military.
Are there religious hierarchical structures in any branch of Islam?
Sunni Muslims constitute the vast majority of Islam's global membership. Since the generation that succeeded Muhammad, the dominant ideal of governance has been that a leader should be first among equals. Centuries of caliphal splendor might persuade a student of history that a type of monarchy was the preferred form of Islamic governance. In practice, many of the most powerful Muslim rulers over the centuries have at least tried to call the shots religiously as well as politically. Nevertheless, Sunni Islam has never evolved quite the kind of hierarchical structure found, for example, in Roman Catholicism. Muslim authority structures in various countries and regions often take the form of councils of religious or legal scholars, or of imams. In practice, jurisdiction in matters of religious law and discipline is limited generally to the confines of modern nation-states. Following a very different model, the largest branch of Shia Islam, Twelver or Imamite Shi'ism, has evolved a much more centralized authority structure. As a result of the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the Ayatollah Khomeini and his followers sought to replace a monarchy with a theocracy. They established a pyramidal hierarchy of religious authority with Khomeini at the top. He was the most influential of a number of leading Ayatollahs, Sign of God, and won the title Imam by virtue of his dominance. Below him was a cluster of Grand Ayatollahs and a larger group of lesser Ayatollahs. Just beneath them were two ranks of religious scholars with the title Hujjatul Islam, Proof of Islam, and finally the several thousand mullahs, from a word that means roughly master, reverend, who staffed the country's mosques.
Have Buddhists always depicted the Buddha in painting and sculpture?
For generations after the Buddha's death, his followers hesitated to depict the teacher in human form. Perhaps they avoided direct visual representation out of respect for the Buddha, one too sacred to be so portrayed. Whatever the motivation, early Buddhist artists chose a variety of symbols to represent the Buddha. Early Christian artists likewise refrained from depicting Christ in human form, opting for symbols like the fish and the empty cross. The most important symbols for the Buddha included the riderless horse, the parasol, the tree, the empty throne, footprints, the eight-spoked wheel, and the stupa. A riderless horse recalled the Buddha's renunciation and departure from his father's palace. Parasols were symbols of royalty and represented the great honor due to an enlightened one. Buddha reached enlightenment beneath the Bo tree, and artists often left a space before the tree to suggest the presence of the Buddha. Some scenes place an empty throne beneath the tree. Artists sometimes choose to show a pair of footprints just in front of the throne. Footprints also appear by themselves somewhere in a scene to indicate where the Buddha would have been. A wheel of 8 spokes was a reminder of the Eightfold Noble Path and the Four Noble Truths. Depictions of a stupa, resting place of the Buddha's remains. Frequently served as a reminder of his spiritual presence. Several other items especially popular in China among the 8 auspicious signs include a pair of fish. Symbol of universal Indian monarchy, the lotus blossom of purity, and the conch shell of victory. Chinese Buddhist altars often held clay or carved wooden images of these symbols.
What is a menorah?
Menorah means an object that emits light, hence a candle holder. A 7-candle menorah was used in the ancient temple and has continued to be perhaps the most widely known and used Jewish symbol. When the Romans despoiled the Jerusalem temple in 70, they carted away all the temple's riches. They regarded the menorah as such an important emblem of their conquest that the Emperor Titus had it depicted on his triumphal arch in the Roman Forum. Some scholars suggest the menorah is a variation on the symbolic tree of life that grew at the center of the original Paradise Garden, versions of which are widely used in many cultures and religious traditions. An 8-branched candlestick, now also called a menorah, features prominently in the 8-day observance of Hanukkah.
How many different kinds of scriptural interpretation are there?
One of the most interesting and volatile areas in the study of religion involves the many ways the different religious traditions read their sacred texts. Virtually every tradition has developed a range of approaches, often applying several to the same text to bring out its various levels of meaning. Every credible interpreter starts from a basic hermeneutical principle. If you want to be true to the text, you must first know what kind of text it is.
What was the religion of the Maya?
The Maya civilization of Mesoamerica grew out of a very early agrarian way of life. Beginning around 2500 BCE in the tropical rainforest lowlands of northern Guatemala, the area now known as El Petén. Maya civilization has been divided into 5 periods, beginning with the formative period. Around 1500 BCE and ending with the arrival of the Spaniards in the 16th century. Religion was a major part of the everyday lives of the Maya. With more than 160 different gods, the Maya spent much time fasting, praying, and offering sacrifices to the deities in hopes that they would bring rain and good crops, good health, and good luck. The universal creative force was referred to as Hunabku. And the towering ceiba tree was called the Axis Mundi, or tree of life, which was thought to reside in all 3 levels of the cosmos. Roots in the underworld, Zibalba, trunk in the middle world, and branches in the heavens. Trees were thought to represent the sustainer of life because of their role in rain cycles. And the Maya believed that when the last tree disappeared, so would the people. The Maya had a corn god, a rain god, a sun god, and a moon goddess, among many others. Each god or goddess influenced a specific part of Maya life. For example, the goddess of the moon, Ninchel, was said to control medicine and weaving. In the great ceremonial centers, priests and priestesses were often involved in vision-producing rites that would supposedly allow them to communicate with the gods. Maya carvings and paintings show men and women ceremoniously piercing parts of their bodies to shed blood and induce higher states of consciousness. Women often pierce their tongues and men their penises, using stingray spines, flints, or thorns. Blood was dripped onto bark paper and the paper was burned as an offering to the gods. Humans, often captured enemy warriors, were ritually sacrificed to appease the gods. The victim would be held down upon an altar and a priest would slit his chest under the rib cage and tear out the heart. Stone carvings of a reclining figure known as the chikmul, which is pictured holding a bowl or platform for a bowl, were thought to be receptacles for sacrificed hearts or blood. Captives were also tortured, bled, and decapitated. Some sacrificial victims were tossed into deep natural water holes, cenotes, to plead with the rain god for water. When an important person or ruler died, his servants were often killed and buried with him.
What is a jinn?
You've probably heard stories about the magical powers of genies who appear when someone rubs a magic lamp just right. The word genie comes from the Arabic word jinn, which refers to creatures of smokeless fire who inhabit a mysterious realm somewhere between the human and the divine. According to popular lore in Muhammad's time, the jinns would eavesdrop on the heavenly councils and offer to divulge their secrets to a soothsayer, called a kahin, pronounced kaahin, who uttered the proper formula. Some of Muhammad's early critics charged that he was not a prophet but just another Majnun, pronounced Majnoon, one possessed by a jinn. To call someone Majnun is to question the person's credibility as well as sanity. Countless jinns inhabit the world, some mischievous and some helpful and benevolent. King Solomon had the special gift of taming the jinn and enlisting them for the construction of his majestic temple. Particularly troublesome are the frighteningly ugly jinns called ghouls, from which we get the word ghoul. For those who do not know how to handle them, jinns can make life unpleasant, but their powers are limited.
Have there ever been any reform movements within Hinduism?
Since the early 19th century, various important reform movements have addressed the need to reinterpret ancient tradition for modern times. The Brahmo Samaj, Society of God, denounced the practice of widow suicide, Sati, and promoted a monotheistic understanding of Hindu faith. Its successor organization, the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj, Universal Society of God, took aim at the caste system and looked for ways to update the tradition without having to resort to European ways of thinking. Some reformers, such as Ramankrishna, 1836–86, and his disciple Vivekananda, 1863–1902, offered fresh interpretations of both Bhakti and Vedanta that they hoped would appeal to the world beyond India. 20th-century successors to those pioneering reformers included Sri Aurobindo, 1872–1950, and Mahatma Gandhi, 1869–1948. Both studied in England and returned with distinctive views on how modern Hindus might revitalize their traditions. Sri Aurobindo proposed a form of modernist interpretation incorporating elements of European philosophy, and Gandhi emphasized simplicity of life and taught nonviolent means of political protest. Both men founded ashrams, quiet places in which spiritual seekers could find spiritual refuge.
How do Daoism and CCT commemorate death and mourning ritually?
Special rites are designed for those approaching death, for burial day and for subsequent memorials. For the elderly and terminally ill, ceremonies can include rituals related to aging and specific illnesses. Prayers for longevity might include, for example, recitation from the scripture called the Northern Dipper's Extension of Life. Traditional funerals conducted under Daoist auspices can be very elaborate. At many funerals, a central feature is the recitation of scripture, often performed, curiously, by Buddhist monks or nuns. Many Chinese, both in China and in places like Malaysia where there are sizable Chinese communities, still choose to bury their dead in distinctive graves. A horseshoe-shaped stone or concrete enclosure is set into a gentle slope with the open side to the south and the arms of the horseshoe inclining toward the south, following the principles of Feng Shui. The enclosure helps to contain the maximum positive qi while allowing necessary drainage. Burial ceremonies typically conclude with placing a memorial or name tablet atop the coffin during final prayers. The coffin is then buried, head to the south, within the semicircular enclosure. Family members take the tablet home for installation on the domestic altar. Weekly rituals held from the 7th to the 49th day after death may be even more complex than that of the actual burial. Salvation rituals are especially important in cases of violent or premature death. In order to liberate such unfortunate souls, a ritual of crossing over is designed to shatter the very portals of the underworld. The so-called Ghost Festival, held either at the end of a cosmic renewal or on The 15th day of the 7th month, placates the hungry spirits with often elaborate offerings and animal sacrifice presided over by 7 officiants. For those who died before being able to marry. Posthumous spirit marriages engage a living proxy to marry the deceased person symbolically, while allowing the proxy to proceed with his or her marriage plans in due course.
What kinds of special ritual objects figure in Christian worship and prayer?
In addition to the cross or crucifix, Christians use a variety of ritual objects. More commonly in liturgical communities than in non-liturgical ones. The more elaborate the liturgical practice, in general, the more kinds of symbolic and practical implements are required. Most Christian churches have an altar on a raised platform in front of, or in the midst of, the congregation. Exceptions are Pentecostal and similar groups whose primary rituals revolve entirely around preaching, singing, and the ongoing interaction of the leaders with the congregation. Churches such as the Roman and Anglo-Catholic, most Eastern churches and some Lutheran groups feature a ritual that includes some reenactment of the Eucharistic prayer. Their ritual leader typically wears special vestments and handles the sacred vessels. A large cup called the chalice, traditionally either made of or lined with precious metal, holds the wine, grape juice in some churches. A still larger vessel called the ciborium, Latin for food container, kept covered except during the prayers of consecration, holds the altar bread either in the form of small unleavened wafers or leavened cubes that can be dipped into the wine before dispensing to communicants. Another common implement used in more elaborate liturgies is the Thursdayable or incense burner. A small spherical container with a lighted charcoal for igniting grains of incense, which is swung from a chain in gestures of benediction. Less common but worth mentioning if only because of its artistic beauty is the ostensorium or monstrance. A large ornate device shaped like a spectacular sunburst or a small Gothic cathedral used for displaying the consecrated host during special processions or for Western congregational adoration.
Has martyrdom ever been important in Christian history?
According to Christian tradition, Stephen was the first person to die for his commitment to faith in Jesus Christ, Acts 6-7. Paul, one of those among the crowd that stoned Stephen to death, would later become a martyr himself, as would Peter and many others among the earliest Christians. In Christian prayer, martyrs have enjoyed an honor above that of all other saints. Most of the martyrs whose stories are told in a literary form called martyrology lived during the first 3 centuries, the time of direst persecution by Roman authorities. But martyrs more recently have also been celebrated for their witness to the faith as missionaries in far-flung lands. The high age of missionary martyrs coincided roughly with the opening of new maritime routes around the globe. Even more recently, a young woman shot to death in a Colorado school massacre has been hailed as a martyr. For when her assailant asked her if she believed in God, she bravely said yes and died moments later. Martyrs are those who witness to their faith regardless of the threat of dire consequences to themselves.
What is the Jewish calendar?
The Jewish calendar is lunisolar, that is, it is regulated by the positions of both the moon and the sun. There are 12 alternating lunar months of 29 and 30 days each. The year totals 353, 354, or 355 days. Leap years are introduced to conform to the solar year of 365.25 days. Leap years contain an extra 30-day period called First Adar. Leap years contain either 383, 384, or 385 days and occur 7 times in every 19-year period. This is called the metonic cycle. Thus, the number of days in a given year is not fixed and may vary from 353 to 385 days. And the first day of the month can fall on any day of the week and will vary from year to year.
What rites do Hindus practice at home?
In their homes, many Hindus engage in a smaller scale version of temple puja, morning, noon, and evening. Miniature shrines often occupy a special corner, where all the necessary materials and implements for worship are kept. Puja begins with entering into the proper frame of mind and with invocations. Placing flower petals on the image, along with water and other elements, ghee, honey, milk, reminds devotees of the intimacy of their relationship with God. They symbolize that intimacy with actions and materials that communicate deep affection and warmth, both in the home and in the temple. God is the guest whom the host and hostess strive to make perfectly welcome. Making the deity beautiful often means clothing the images in elaborate garments as well. People sometimes invite a priest to come to their homes to pray, but generally the head of the household leads the home puja. Many Hindu householders regularly perform the individual morning prayer before sunrise. Facing east with the sacred thread over the left shoulder, worshippers take a sip of water, pronounce mantras over ashes, and place them on their foreheads, arms, ribs, and knees. To be purified of sin, they pray the Gayatri mantra, a lovely short hymn to the light of the sun. Several different forms of prayer might include facing the various cardinal directions while performing slightly different ritual actions. Other domestic rituals can include special celebrations associated with building and entering a new home for the first time. Other occasions marked with religious rituals at home include especially The various rites of passage associated with birth and early infancy.
Who was Lao Zi?
Lao Zi was likely an altogether legendary figure whose name simply means old teacher or master. Tradition says he was born around 604 BCE, making him a much older contemporary of Confucius. Kongfu Zi, 551 to 479 BCE, who was in turn an almost exact contemporary of the Buddha. The legend says Lao Zi was a clerk in the archives of the Zhou dynasty who practiced the way and its power and emphasized self-effacement and anonymity. When he became convinced that social disintegration and political corruption in the Zhou dynasty were irreversible, he decided to withdraw from society. Riding his water buffalo, the old man came to the frontier. There a customs officer besought him to write down his lofty teachings before departing. Lao Zi wrote the Dao De Jing, the classic of the way and its power, and disappeared, leaving a legacy of mystery. Much later stories, perhaps from a time when Daoists and Confucians were in competition for followers, tell of a meeting between Lao Zi and a youthful Confucius. No use wasting so much time studying your history, Lao Zi counseled the newcomer. Observe nature and you will see that love for the Dao is all that one needs. Popular tradition tends to identify Lao Zi as the one who first taught that ordinary folk could seek and attain immortality. Some scholars suggest that Lao Zi's legendary stature may have been enhanced as a result of his mistaken identification with the legendary Huangdi, known as the Yellow Emperor who ruled in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. Lao Zi was officially declared a god around 666 CE.
Have there been any Confucian mystics?
Scholars of the history of religion rarely describe the Confucian tradition as a wellspring of mystical spirituality. But several important figures, particularly among the Neo-Confucians, spoke a language reminiscent of some of the great monistic mystics of other traditions. Zhu Xi, a leading light in the Neo-Confucian school of principle, saw in the practice of meditation a way of becoming one with cosmic harmony. One could draw instructive parallels between traditional descriptions of this type of meditation and of certain qualities of the sage, and characteristics of nature mystics in other traditions. In Zhu Xi's view, silent sitting promised the realistic possibility of experiencing unity with all things and all people. Wang Yangming, a later exponent of the Neo-Confucian school of mind, spoke of realizing one's true self in a meditative quest for enlightenment. He identified cosmic principle, Li, with the mind, so that discovery of the true self meant discovering the ultimate reality. Some discern parallels between Wang's mysticism and that of the German mystic Meister Eckhart, c. 1260–1327 CE.
Is it appropriate to call Shinto a religious tradition?
Religious studies scholars have increasingly come to appreciate the genuinely religious qualities of Shinto. Every now and then criticism still surfaces that Shinto is so much a part of ordinary Japanese life that it is really a set of cultural beliefs and practices rather than a religious tradition. Some critics base their conclusion on polls of the Japanese public that seem to suggest widespread apathy about religious issues. Decreasing numbers of people are willing to identify themselves as adherents of any religious tradition, including Shinto. Other critics note that even Japanese who do consider themselves active participants in a Shinto-based community are likely to claim that they are Buddhist as well.
What is meant by the term rectification of names?
If Confucius were here today, he would surely be aghast at the way inflated language seems to have taken over ordinary conversation. I was so tired I was literally dead on my feet. No, you weren't, he might say. Drop the literally and your expression will have far more impact, even though your surrounding culture insists that more is better. He would be amazed to hear restaurant staff introduce themselves as your food and beverage counselor, or hear store cashiers and stockers identified as sales associates and inventory specialists. But Confucius would worry less about such trivial matters than about the very same deep social issues he agonized over in his own time. When a man fails to show respect to his parents, do not call him a son. If he fails to guide his children, he is unworthy to be called a father. If a woman does not attend to her family faithfully, one can hardly call her a wife or mother. If a man is unfaithful to his wife, do not call him a husband. Of greatest political import is his insistence that no unjust ruler deserves the name emperor. Beneath this apparently nitpicking criticism, Confucius was getting at a profound truth: over the long haul, imprecise speech allows injustice to go unnoticed because it can be hidden behind acceptable names. Euphemism can erode one's sense of right and wrong and desensitize a person to violence. Eventually we persuade ourselves that misspeaking is not a lie, or that stealing is nothing more than the redistribution of wealth. Confucius believed that language matters because it not only reflects, but can even change, the way we think.
How have Confucianism and literati traditions interacted?
Confucius was one of the literati, but he and the movement that bears his name have also had a life of their own. The literati were the social class most responsible for maintaining all the mechanisms of the imperial administration. One of their chief tools was an elaborate system of training that culminated in civil service examinations. The grandfather of all civil service systems, and the awarding of degrees. When the imperial examination system was abolished in 1905 in favor of more modern educational methods, the literati began to disappear as a social class. In 1911, the last emperor was deposed, ending 3 millennia of Chinese imperial rule. But Confucius did not die with the literati and the empire. For over the centuries he had become an integral part of Chinese culture. He was both a symbol of the best in Chinese tradition and a man revered religiously as well. There is some overlapping, therefore, among these three developments: Confucianism, the literati tradition, and the CIT, but they are not identical. Think of them as a railway that has sometimes run along a single track and sometimes branched off into 2 or 3 parallel tracks along the same broad right-of-way. In short, all literati were Confucians, and since CIT in general incorporated the Confucian philosophy, the literati became the official staff of CIT. But not all those who consider themselves Confucians are literati. And with the end of the empire came the end of the literati as a cultural/religious elite.
Are the teachings of racial supremacist groups consistent with Christian tradition?
Members of a number of white supremacist groups, such as the Aryan Nations and the Ku Klux Klan, frequently display ostensibly Christian imagery and quote the Bible as part of their inflammatory racist rhetoric. Some of the leaders of these groups present themselves as ministers or leaders of small dissenting churches, providing haven for people disillusioned with American society and looking for religious justification for their views. Preachers and leaders of these groups often present their message as if it were biblically sanctioned, citing passages from both the Old and New Testament that might be interpreted as indicators of divine preference for one race over another.